In our Conversations with Great Minds today, Stacy Mitchell drops by to talk about democracy, plutocracy, and giant corporations in need of being broken up. Check it out, leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. I want to do a deep dive into some of the issues that really hit all of us, at least all of us who aren't multimillionaires or billionaires, in very real ways. These are issues that affect towns and cities and rural areas. These are just massive issues. The whole broad issue of democracy, plutocracy, big corporations, the power of big corporations, monopoly. And my guest for the hour is Stacy Mitchell. Stacy is the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. The website for that institute is, as you might think, ilsr.org, as in Institute for Local Self-Reliance. She's the author of a couple of books, Big Box Swindle, The True Cost of Mega Retailers and the Fight for America's Independent Businesses, and Hometown Advantage, How to Defend Your Main Street Against Chain Stores and Why It Matters. On Twitter, her Twitter handle is Stacy F. Mitchell, Mitchell. And Stacy, welcome to the program. It's so great to have you with us.
It's really nice to be here. Thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you for being willing to devote this time to us, because I think that this is this is an issue that's really worth a deep dive. And you're one of the real thought leaders on this. I'd like to start with this piece that you published in The Nation magazine just a few weeks ago over at thenation.com. You can find the article. The headline is "Why the Left Should Ally or Ally with Small Businesses," and then the subhead, "It will strengthen labor and help fight the increasing concentration of corporate power." If we could start there, let's, small businesses. I'm constantly hearing Republicans, well, for example, when Trump was promoting his, $1.5 trillion tax cut back in 2017, he was saying, we're going to help small businesses. Mitch McConnell was saying, we're going to help small businesses. The Chamber of Commerce comes out and says, tax cuts like this will help small businesses. Everybody wants to talk about small businesses. What's the real state of small business in America? And what's the real dynamic going on here?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you hear politicians of every political persuasion talking about small business. And the reality is that independent businesses have been in sharp decline for the last 30 years or so, and particularly accelerated in the last 10 years. And then, of course, the pandemic and the failed policy response to the pandemic has only exacerbated all of that in the last several months. So independent businesses are a shrinking share of the economy. They've declined from about 40% of the economy in the 1980s to only about 23% of the economy today. And those that exist in many cases are really struggling. And one other thing I should add about the state of independent businesses is that it's also become a lot harder to start a business. We think we're this nation of entrepreneurs and startup companies, but in fact, America is creating new businesses at only about a third of the rate that it was in the 1980s. And so we've seen a real sharp drop in the number of new businesses that are getting started every year.
Yeah, well, that's the story of my life. I've been a serial entrepreneur my entire life. I've started 7 businesses. 5 of them were pretty successful. And one went down in spectacular flames, and you learn from those things. But back when I was starting businesses, I mean, I started my first business in I think 69 or 70. You didn't have to, you could get health insurance for $30 a month, Blue Cross. This was in Michigan. It was required to be a nonprofit. The housing was relatively inexpensive. It was an entirely different landscape from today, where if you don't have a job and don't have health insurance and I never started businesses with my own money because I didn't have any. I mean, it's just a lower middle class kid, and today that's so much harder. What are the dynamics that have conspired against would-be entrepreneurs, in addition to the ones I identified? And if you want to expand on those, please do so.
Yeah, well, I think, it's one of the things that's useful to understand is sort of the history of the 20th century. There was a period of time really from the 1930s until the 1970s or 1980s when the Democratic Party had this philosophy towards the economy, by and large, that was about how do we disperse economic power. There was really a sense from Franklin Roosevelt and that whole New Deal period that the biggest threat to the well-being of Americans and to our democracy was concentrated economic power. So the idea was we need to have policies in place that dispersed that power and made sure that ownership, decision-making, agency over the economy was shared broadly across Americans rather than concentrated in a few hands. And there were a lot of different strategies for how you did that. Labor unions were one way to do that, to give ordinary people a say on the job and a fair share of their livelihood. So supporting strong labor unions. But small business was another. And that New Deal period through the mid-20th century was a period in which Democrats especially, but also to some degree Republicans, very much had a strong anti-monopoly policy. We had policies in place that ensured that there were banks all across the country, local community banks that do the lion's share of lending to small businesses. So in a variety of ways, we really used policy tools to ensure that this was an open economy with a fair playing field for small and independent businesses. It's important to sort of caveat that period by saying that a lot of those policies deliberately excluded women and people of color. So I don't want to say that that's an era we should go back to in its entirety by any means, but there are pieces of that era that really worked well in terms of a more equitable kind of economy. That all shifted. Today, what we have created really since the 80s, led in some part by the right, but also very much by the Democratic Party as well, as I detail in the article in The Nation, is a policy environment in which we heavily favor the biggest corporations, in which we have essentially, put our antitrust policies on a shelf, and we no longer police bullying and sort of gross abuses of market power that are going on, where you're effectively not allowed to compete just because you're small, not because you can't compete fairly. We have a financial system that denies credit to small businesses. Big banks do very little small business lending. And so as the small local banks have disappeared, we're just starving our local economy of capital. And you see this, you see it in tax policy tilts the playing field. I mean, if you're a local neighborhood store, you're paying, 20% effective federal tax break. Meanwhile, you're competing against Amazon, which is paid effectively no taxes. So in all these different ways, and we also even see it at the local level and how we handle, land use and economic development, favors Walmart, favors chain restaurants in all sorts of ways. And this is a mindset that has led to a whole web of policies that we really need to rethink.
Yeah, from the ground up. Was there a moment in time when all this changed? It seems to me like the Reagan Revolution was the key to it. We have about 30 seconds, and then we're going to hit a break, and we can continue right after that break, but we're going to have to pause for just a second.
Yeah, that's right. It's an ideology that took hold in the 70s and then really became codified in law in the 80s.
So, Stacy, my dad used to refer to himself as a Main Street Republican. It was a very different Republican Party back then. I mean, I'm talking about the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. What happened? Where did the Main Street Republicans go?
It's a good question. I think there's this ideological shift that began to happen where both parties in different ways embrace the idea that bigger is better. That bigger corporations would, deliver more for consumers, that they would outperform, that was the way to grow the economy and have, more and more output and all of these kinds of ideas, as well as just the sort of corruption, if you will, of campaign finance and the ability to raise lots of cash from these companies. And over time, as they grew, they sort of took more and more, sort of snowballed as bigger companies gained more economic size, they gained more political clout, they could alter the rules in their favor. and that swept through the Republican Party, but it also, swept through the Democratic Party. Reagan came in and he, utterly gutted our antitrust laws in a kind of coup, if you will, in the sense that the antitrust enforcement agencies radically changed how the laws are interpreted and therefore how they're enforced. The laws are still on the books. I mean, Congress never repealed them. They're still there. But there was this sort of coup that happened under Reagan where those laws were effectively, sort of put on the shelf, if you will, and ignored in various ways. But Clinton came in and as a Democrat, that was the moment when there could have been we could have pushed back against that. But instead, he actually doubled down. He very much endorsed that approach to antitrust and then led an effort to undo the banking policies that had kept banks in check and kept them more locally focused and small scale. Clinton led the way in overturning those Depression-era laws and then also led the way in getting rid of our media ownership laws that kept media from consolidating into the hands of a few people. And Obama continued down that path. So I think it's really important to understand that this is a history of both the right and the left.
Yeah, and I was talking about this in the last hour that Reagan set out to defund the Democratic Party, and the major funder of the Democratic Party were the unions, and Reagan gutted the unions. And so Clinton was like, where am I going to get money from? Well, let's get it from the banks. Let's get it from the insurance companies. Let's get it from the real estate industry. We'll leave the dirty industries to the Republicans. They can have oil. But, we'll take all these other, the health insurance companies. And, and here we are. Do you have hope that the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration, will change that?
I do. I mean, I think it's going to take work. It's going to take a fight, if you will. But that's always sort of the case. I think I'm, encouraged. I guess my sense of Biden, and I haven't followed him super closely. I certainly don't know him, but my sense of him is that he is very much likes to be in the center of the road. And I think the center of the road is shifting, and that concerns about monopoly power is ascendant.